There's also a product out there, super strong woven poly. If you're interested in it, it is, as the name implies, super strong. You can walk on it. It can actually withstand some hailstorms. We have 2 growers in the western part of the state that have this, and one of them did withstand a hailstorm that just came in and destroyed polycarbonate. But it's very expensive. And it's 11 mil thick, and it shades your crop a little bit more. It's got some fibers in it, and you do get increased shading. Yes?
I also say I have some of that. It's rip-proof.
Yeah.
You can't tear a hole in it. There's a hole in it. You cannot open it up anymore.
Are you pretty happy with that?
I just got it in a year.
Can you give him the microphone?
I've only had it for a year, so I've experienced you can't rip it. It's diffuse light rather than direct, so it scatters the light. It's not a straight line, so I'm not sure how the crops are going to do in it. But
I think most of the time, maybe really midwinter when it's really cloudy and cool and stuff, we might see some issues, but most of the time I think we'd be fine. But overall, structurally, you're pretty happy with it.
It has a 10 to 15 year life too, so
Yeah.
you have to factor that into the cost.
Right.
It comes out over time.
And so if you go this way, it does cost more, but you're going to get an increased lifespan. But just make sure, maybe 8 years into that, if that plastic's not staying clean, it's full of dirt and stuff, it is going to cut down your shade. But the stuff's really strong. You can walk on it. It's pretty bomb-proof. Shade cloth, this is up to you. I don't know if I'd invest in shade cloth. If you did, I probably wouldn't go more than 40%. We have some growers that like to do greens, midsummer in the tunnels, lettuces and that sort of thing, and to keep the shade cloth, to keep it cool. I don't necessarily think I'd go with it, but I know some people are very happy with that. Yes?
It's really good if you're doing transplants. The shade cloth is really good if you're doing transplants.
And that's spring transplants, and so that's something where you might not have to buy something to cover the whole tunnel, just a small area, and save some money there as well. Single layer plastic, this is actually a grower. I was over in Lebanon last November into December, and they do a lot of tunnel production there. This is in northern Lebanon on the Syrian border, and they use a lot of single layer plastic. No, it wasn't Lebanon, Kentucky. And I'll have some pictures later, but if you walked into some of these tunnels, you would not be able to tell if you were in Kentucky or over there. I mean, they have the same crop rotation that we have. They were relatively similar latitude, very similar temperatures. They get hotter in the summer, but on some of the peaks there was a good bit of snow when I was there. Very, very similar production system, actually. It's kind of interesting. Double layer plastic, which is something I would encourage people to go after, but you're probably going to need some form of electric, which if you're putting a tunnel a quarter mile from your house, that's going to be a problem. Or a lot of our Amish and Mennonite growers that don't use electric around the state, just find a way to keep some distance between that plastic. These foam blocks, I'm not sure how they'll affect the life of the plastic, because some of the foams and products like that will off-gas volatiles that can degrade the plastic. But just finding a way to keep some airspace between there will help increase your R value. A little bit on venting, because I think this is very, very important. I would, if I was doing this NRCS program, get roll-up sidewalls, since the money's usually there for it. Ridge vents can be a good option, depending upon the type that you get, and I'm going to show them. And I probably wouldn't go more than a 16-foot tunnel as far as height, because you lose all that heat, just hangs out up top when you need it, and so probably 14 to 16 is about as tall as I would go. I've had a number of questions about horizontal airflow fans, and this kind of borders onto greenhouse territory, but it's something that I would seriously consider. And Kenny will talk about it when he talks about disease, but even moving humid air is a lot better than stagnant humid air. And horizontal airflow fans they're not the big fans on the outside, they're just these smaller, usually 14 to 18-inch fans. When you put them in there, they just work to move air around your structure. They're generally not as expensive, well, not nearly as expensive as your big fans, and it might be something worth looking into, particularly if you're having a lot of issues with humidity and leaf molds. If you do want to put them in, a typical pattern would be 4 fans for the typical high tunnel. You'd orient them in this fashion. two on each side going the same direction, and that's kind of the pattern you'd want to use. You don't want them fighting each other, you don't want them pointed towards each other or anything like that. But this might be an option, like I said, particularly if you're having humidity problems with a lot of botrytis or leaf molds. Ridge vents, this is actually a structure out of southwest Kentucky, and this is the real deal. It's a big ridge vent, very nice, very expensive. Hands down the best way to vent them, but very, very pricey. And so this is an option that most folks don't have. This particular grower had it. Never really got his greenhouse all that much more above ambient temperatures if he didn't want it. Does work very well. But as you can see, there's a lot more steel in there. It adds significantly to the price. Other types of ridge vents, these are commonly sold. These contain a wax-filled cylinder. As it gets hotter out, the cylinder expands and opens the vents up. These can be put in your end walls like so, or they can actually be put in your plastic near the top of the ridge. By and large, folks generally are not that happy with these. If you put them in your plastic along the ridge, they just don't have that much of a surface area to let air out. They don't seal that well either. And you have to remove these cylinders in the wintertime because if they freeze, they crack and then they don't work anymore. And so, if you wanted to put one of these in your end wall or something for supplemental venting, I think they would be appropriate, but certainly I wouldn't look at these as a primary source of venting. As for sidewalls, many different options out there with your kit if you're going to buy them. Here's a roll-up sidewall, typical gear-driven motor. Here's the type we have at the South Farm here. It's an Atlas one. You'll see the pipe goes down the middle of it, and so that it keeps it a little bit cleaner, but you do lose some space here. When you roll these up, you lose about a foot of space to vent. So right here you have a gap? Okay. So the question is, this plastic here, how do you have this attached? And actually this is very important. If you've got roll-up sidewalls, a lot of them have a fairly large gap on the side, and certain times of year, if you're not going to button that whole sidewall down, you should have some plastic here so you're not losing heat. And so basically this is just a wiggle wire channel. You'll have a channel being attached to the bow here and to the end wall, and that's very important. A lot of these sidewalls actually, they have one where it's got a lock here for the roller, and it actually pulls it out about 3 inches. And on those, they recommend inflating this plastic, actually, if you can. And then, like I said, that's just the other type of roll-up. And then, of course, homemade ingenuity. This works just as well, too. And then other gear-driven roll-up sidewalls. This is actually the type that I was talking about. It's got a little lock here. And so this plastic should be inflated because it'll blow out to here and kind of seal up because your sidewall will stick out about this far. So when you're getting these sidewalls, think about what you're buying and what that's going to entail as far as sealing up your structure. These gear down the sidewall at a ratio of, I think, 4 to 1. They make it a little bit easier. They add about $75 to the cost. And so it's just up to you if you choose to get one of those. For vent fans, I've had a number of questions about vent fans. I didn't think we'd ever have people putting vent fans in tunnels, but we do, and so I just wanted to cover this. Typically, for greenhouse purposes, if you do 1 air exchange per minute, which is moving a lot of air, you can maintain it about 8 degrees warmer than ambient temperatures. And that's kind of an average, but on a decent sunny day, if you're relying just on your vent fans, 1 air exchange a minute, you can get it down to about 8 degrees warmer. So, on a typical 30 by 72 greenhouse or high tunnel, that'd be 20,000 cubic feet of air. Usually, with folks that are putting in the large vent fans, it's just supplemental. It's not their primary method of venting. And so, you're not necessarily having to worry about moving 20,000 square feet or cubic feet. But if you did want to go that big, to move that much, you're looking at about a 48-inch box fan. Moves 19,000 cubic feet of air per minute, and that's about $750. Tony.
What's the energy use on one of them? The 40-inch box fan, like what they rated at and got the cost figured out?
I don't have the energy use. The folks that are using these have them set on thermostats as kind of a last resort because almost everyone I know with these has another job as their full-time job. And so they're worried, I'm not going to be able to vent this thing, it's going to get sunny, and this will come on and save my crop from getting burned up. And so it's not a permanent type thing, but it's still, that's a pretty good expense, but something worth thinking about. Yes?
think my bill for my fan's about $30 a month.
30 bucks a month for your
Yeah.
fan?
Yeah.
That's pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
For locating tunnels, how many folks, when they located their tunnels, thought about it in terms of light interception and wind, or was it just, I got a flat piece of land right here and this is where it's going? So there's a few folks, and this is, you know, I understand you work with what you have, and so locating tunnels might not necessarily, it might be this is my flat piece and this is where it's going, but typically if you're locating greenhouses for 40 degrees north latitude and lower, you want them on a north-south orientation. However, we're at 38 degrees north latitude, and so we're right on the edge of that, and the benefit from locating them north-south isn't as much as it would be as maybe if you were in Georgia or somewhere like that. Plus, that assumes you're doing typical greenhouse production, midsummer type production, and the sun is high in the horizon. When it comes across your house, it's evenly lighting it. Most people in here are going to want to be in early winter doing greens, crops, and those sorts of things. If you do at our latitude an east-west orientation, you actually get better light penetration in the winter time. In the summer, you have a lot worse light penetration, but usually that time of year, it's not an issue for you. And so as far as light goes, for most individuals, I would probably go in an east-west orientation due to that wintertime production. If you're doing multiple tunnels, then you do want to go, if you're lining them right close to one another, you want to go north-south, because obviously if you're east-west, that first one will shade out the subsequent tunnels.
Do you take into consideration the wind direction? Being most winds coming
Yep.
from the north, right?
Yep, that's the next, actually that's like 2 slides from now, is wind is the next thing. So that's light, which is important, and for a traditional greenhouse structure that's really robust and strong, it's not going to be an issue. But wind is also an issue. High tunnels have a tremendous amount of uplift, and that's probably the biggest thing you're going to be worried about. Not so much, every once in a while if you get an ice storm or snow, you're going to be concerned about it being crushed, but uplift by and large is the most important thing. Wind breaks if possible. There's different terms of thoughts on this. If you want to orient your tunnels perpendicular to the prevailing wind, and the idea is your wind comes through the sidewalls and vents your tunnel. But if you're in an unprotected site and you get a lot of really, really strong winds, if you've got that wind pushing on those bows, they tend to flex inward. And when you have that, you start to have problems. So if you're in a very unprotected site with high winds, it's usually better to have them parallel with your strong winds because the end walls can bear the brunt of that force against them. You're not getting that push on the side. If you're in a real protected area, not subject to a lot of winds, you know, orient them. I would probably go based on light. But if you're on a ridge top or somewhere real out in the open, I'd give wind a strong consideration. And I'll skip ahead. Here's a shot. These are actually greenhouses, but the same type of structure as a tunnel. Now, this is out in western Kentucky. And the wind came across from the side and got underneath the sidewall, opened up a little gap in there, and then got up under the plastic. The plastic didn't tear away real quick, tore up all the bows, and this is almost a complete loss. This was a greenhouse, but like I said, it's the same type of structure as tunnel. And so it can be a pretty serious issue. As far as venting, and this is, I wanted to cover this a little bit with folks, particularly those that are growing tomatoes. This is actually out of a publication where they had some high tunnels, had some insect screening on the sidewalls, but this was done where they actually took some smoke, put it through the tunnel, and they measured airflow and how the crop affects that. And so this would be your high tunnel with no crop in it. Let's assume you're 100% airflow from all sides. Typically, your wind going through here parallel to your tunnel is about at 50% airflow is what you get going from the sides. But at this, assume everything's 100%. If you've got a 3-foot crop in there, your venting, your wind that's moving through the length of the tunnel gets decreased by about 15%. Stuff coming through the sides get decreased almost by 30% with a 3-foot tomato crop in there. If you go up to a 6-foot crop, your wind moving through the end of the tunnel doesn't really decrease all that much more. You're at about 80% of what you were baseline. Moving through the sides of the tunnel, you're at about 45%. And so, I mean, it makes sense. Obviously, you got tall plants in there, but this actually did put some numbers with the values. And so this just shows how much decrease in ventilation you're getting when you've got those taller crops in there. And so it's just something to think about. You might be getting great ventilation here, but on the inside, your tomatoes could be getting eaten up. And so just think about that. A little bit, very briefly, on light intensity, which we're seeing right now. If you were to take your total accumulated light, and that's light intensity and your day length, let's say July and August are 100%, January is about 14% of that. And so obviously those that have experienced growing in tunnels know it's very difficult, even if you can keep the temperatures up, this time of year to get things to fruit real well. A lot of your fruiting plants just don't set fruit very well. You can get fruit, but generally yields are much, much lower, even if temperature's good. And so most folks have a lot of success growing some of the leafier crops and so forth this time of year. Of course, it makes sense as we're going into the cold part of the year anyway, but I had 2 calls last week. People were upset that their tomatoes weren't ripening in their tunnel, and they were keeping it plenty warm enough, but it's generally a light level issue here in Kentucky. And then this is just kind of how it drops. And so when you're doing those fruiting crops, if you're going in March, by the time they're starting to have flowers and set fruit, we're up at 60 or 70% of our total accumulated light, and so we're in pretty good shape. But you see just how quickly that drops off. We go from August at 100%, October we're down to 40%. So it does dramatically decrease here in the fall. That's a good point, John. This is actually taken from central Kentucky. In western Kentucky, it's a lot better, and it's a whole lot more intense. And so if you are in the far western part of the state, you're going to be a little better shape than we are. And that's, if you get all the way out towards Fulton County, you're going to be a good bit better. But do we have anyone from out in the far western part of the state here? Figured they would have probably gone to the Bowling Green meeting. Of course, what can you grow? You can grow pretty much anything. You can grow weeds real well in tunnels too, as everyone knows. Tomatoes, greens, peppers, cucurbits. I want to talk a little bit about cucurbits though, because that is something that we've had trouble with, primarily due to the pollination issues with cucurbits. They do need pollinators coming in. The one exception is parthenocarpic cucumbers. And so they have done well, but we've had a number of growers do squash, some of the small melons and so forth early in the spring. And if you don't have pollinators, you just don't get very good fruit set. And they take up a lot of room too. Squash plants, for what you get out of them in a tunnel, take up a good bit of room. Of course, your tomatoes. How many folks here are growing tomatoes spring tunnel? Wow. It's a lot. People here are much more diverse. A lot of times I'll go in, it's 95% of the people are growing tomatoes in the spring. So that's good, actually. Everyone here is getting pretty diversified. Well, well, with 200 more tunnels in the state, if everyone chose to grow tomatoes, it's going to be a problem. So, of course, your lettuces, mixed greens. I've had folks do potatoes. I think new potatoes do pretty well in tunnels. This was Joe Daniel outside of Bowling Green, doing very well with new potatoes. Pretty quick turnaround. Cucumbers, like I said, the parthenocarpic types don't need pollination. In fact, if you have pollinators in there, the more visits they get, it actually can damage the fruit that's ultimately set. Typically, you associate parthenocarpic cucumbers with the English type cucumbers that are grown in greenhouses, but there are some regular slicer cucumbers that we're used to. The seed are much more reasonable. Johnny's has a new cucumber that's parthenocarpic that they just bred. That's an in-house selection, actually. For the traditional greenhouse cucumbers, of course, seed can be 50 to 70 cents a piece for some of those. So, and then flowers. How many folks here do flowers? Do a few. I'd say cut stems, cut flowers in tunnels are one of the most profitable things you could have. It keeps them super clean, keeps the rain off them. It's a lot of labor to strip the leaves and so forth, but it's something, if you have a market for it, per square foot we haven't seen too much that's much more lucrative than that. Little thing to think about space, particularly if You know, if you're looking at those squash versus tomatoes or something, you know, you're looking at 5 square feet per plant for a squash is going to take up almost twice that. So just thinking about your profitability per unit space. Of course, beans, peppers, greens, onions. In the eastern part of the state, we've had folks do half runner beans with pretty good success, actually. It's kind of neat to see a large trellis in the tunnel. And even your new potatoes do well. Planting density, generally going to be planted a little bit closer. You want to manage that with not being too close because obviously your disease risk is exacerbated then. Covering between rows. How many folks put down some sort of mulch or cover between the rows? Okay, nobody. I'd say if you're, one benefit to that is it's going to keep the humidity down, keep it a little bit more pleasant to work in there in the wintertime. We see pretty much everything. I'll see straw mulch. We'll see, of course, landscape fabric and that sort of thing. If you're doing a real diversified system, the landscape fabric doesn't necessarily work that well, but the straw mulch can work. One thing I'd avoid is using alfalfa hay. That actually, we had a grower in the western part of the state do that, and it can have a virus in it, alfalfa mosaic virus, that in his case actually got into his peppers and did a pretty good job on it.
What about soybean hay?
I don't think that'd be a problem at all.
Unless you
I can't think of any, yeah,
might have a bee mosaic or something.
I can't think of anything really that it would share though. And then this is actually something, I just took a picture because I thought it was kind of a very neat way to do things, where this grower has 2 drip lines on each side of his tomato plant. He ran them actually under. He did it just to kind of keep them out of the way. Of course, if you get a leak, it's a little bit harder to notice right away. A little bit about pollination. And this actually, I think, is not paid much attention to by some folks, and it deserves a little bit more time. Tomatoes. You know, typically out in the field, we get wind, we don't worry about pollination, the flower vibrates and so forth, and fruit gets set. If you're doing tomatoes early in the spring in these tunnels, you have virtually no air movement at times. And so using a bumblebee as a pollinator is a pretty effective tool. We have folks that go through with leaf blowers, have some that shake the plants back and forth, but you got to do that every single day to ensure good fruit set. And so bumblebees work every day usually, unless the weather's really bad. But bumblebees work fairly well. They vibrate when they sit on the flower. They enhance pollination. We've had questions. I know Dr. Besson's here. I think in a meeting a few weeks ago we had a question about using honeybees in tunnels. That would not be preferred. They're obviously aggressive. They're not good pollinators. They spend all day trying to get out of the tunnel. Don't go there. But bumblebees are used by a number of folks in the state, and I think it's worth looking into, particularly if you're going to do a large number of tomato plants in there. Early in the season is when they're most necessary. Once your sidewalls are rowed down and you have a lot of outdoor pollinators coming in and a lot of air movement, it's not a big deal. But early season, it is. They sell bumblebee hives in different classes. A Class C hive is adequate for about 600 to 700 tomato plants. And so if you've got a couple hundred plants in there, if you buy a Class C hive, and that's generally one of the smallest we can get, you're probably going to have to get rid of some of your bees in there because you can get too many visits because they have nothing else to go to and they hang out on there and they can actually damage the flower. Class C hive, you can order it from a company, Coppert, here. Last time we ordered them, they were about $80 for the hive and about $30 for shipping. Generally, they ship out, I believe, on Tuesdays every week. And so you call them up, as long as it's before, or if you call them Wednesday, it's going to wait till next Tuesday. They get shipped out FedEx, and they just come in a little box to you. So that's why the shipping's fairly expensive. This is a Class C hive here. Inside that, it's a little plastic case. It's got a bag of a sugar solution in the bottom of this, and that's what they're actually feeding on. There's generally no queen in these hives. They have about 80 bees in them. It's got a little trap door on it, and so if you need to spray or anything like that, you can open the trap door, they can go in, you can close it, and you can remove your hive when you're choosing to spray. Typically, the company says replace these every 4 weeks, and if I was some 10-acre hydroponic operation in Arizona, I'd be replacing them every 4 weeks. But for our purposes, generally we've seen them stay active for more in the 6 to 8 week range. By that time, it's generally late enough in the year, your sidewalls are rowed down, we're getting enough outdoor pollinators. And so typically one hive would work for the spring growing season. It's something I've seen quite a bit for those that don't do any sort of pollination. It really negatively affects your fruit set. If you do get too many visits, you'll get flower bruising. You get bruises on, I think it's 3 to 4 bruises on a flower is considered ideal for fruit set. But much more than that, you'll see it starts to turn kind of a dark brown. It can actually damage fruit. We've had I would suspect they would do fine with cucurbit crops, but we've had very poor success by and large with cucurbits. I know bumblebees, Rick, are very good cucurbit pollinators, but I've just worked with, I'd say probably close to a dozen folks that have done cucurbits, and outside of the cucumbers just have not had really good success.
But they use the bees?
They did. About half of them used bees, half of them relied on, the ones that relied on outside pollinators, forget it. It just doesn't work.
Then what do you do with the bumblebees when you're done with them?
They die out, actually. Yeah, since it's a kind of a terminal hive, after, you'll start seeing them start dying off after about 3 to 4 weeks, and they just... They can if you get in their way, but by and large, Chris is raising his hand because he got stung. But by and large, I've never been stung by them.
If you don't grab them,
If you don't mess with them, they're pretty cool.